Hello and welcome to also Twixmas. I very much hope you enjoyed our opening evening yesterday, and particularly the session with Priya about hospitality and generosity. That's now available to go back and take a look at if you missed it, and it's really beautiful. And for those of you who joined us at Ferdy's DJ Twixmas set with Nikki, that was just so much fun. It really is incredible how much joy and fun can we had dancing around our respective houses together apart, which I'm sure you know is the kind of theme of our 3-day festival today. So I'm Helen Bagnall. I'm one of the founders of Also Festival and also Salon London. And as I said in our introduction in Gigantic yesterday, we very much wanted to do something to kind of help with the heavy lifting that our brains have had to do this year with COVID as part of our Twixmas festival. Because, you know, since we began doing Salon and also festival, we've always been working with really interesting neuroscientists, psychiatrists, therapists, and looking at lots of different ways in which we can really help our brain process with the way that we live, because our brains are very precious to us. So as part of the festival, we're taking 3 very different approaches to stress, anxiety, depression, overthinking, and this is the first one in that series of 3. Again, as I mentioned yesterday, this session is open to anyone at all. It's part of our kind of work to try and help getting big ideas to help with the way that we think out there. And if you want anyone to join us, they're more than welcome. Or if you want to take a look afterwards, it will be available if you wanted to send this session on to someone who it might help. Because we are talking to Pia Callesen, who is beaming in from Denmark. We're very international in our festival today. And she is a therapist, and she is the author of the #1 Danish bestseller, Live More, Think Less, with the subtitle Overcoming Depression and Sadness with Metacognitive Therapy. And we're going to be finding out all about metacognitive therapy with Pia today. The idea... Well, hello, Pia.
Hello.
Hello. So Pia there is a metacognitive specialist. She manages a clinic in Denmark, and she actually did her PhD here in Manchester. So big links to the UK. Her book, Live More, Think Less, presents a radical strategy to take back control of our thinking processes and to help us deal with the struggle with overthinking. So I'm going to be talking to her about that today. If you would like to ask Pia any questions, please do through our Zerucci Q&A function, and I can put them to Pia, and I'll try and weave them in as they come through. So Pia, how have things been in Denmark? How is the mental health of people in the happiest country in the world?
Well, we had some shutdown. The corona shutdown has happened here too, so no one can go to restaurants. Everything's closed down, so people are staying at home, and there's a lot of problems with loneliness, and people are thinking a lot because they're very much alone now. So yeah, people are not that happy as they used to be in Denmark, but we're managing because now the vaccine has come, so there's a bit of hope in Denmark as well.
Okay, so we want to talk a bit about metacognition and metacognitive therapy, which is your area of expertise. I wondered if you could tell us, just to give us a little overview of what this is, so we can begin to understand the terms.
Yeah. Well, actually, the man behind metacognitive therapy is actually from Manchester University, Professor Adrian Wells. So he's British, and I was doing cognitive therapy. Maybe a lot of you know about cognitive therapy. I've been doing that for 10 years, which is trying to challenge your beliefs and make you think a little bit more balanced, a little bit more positive. But then when I did my PhD, I realized I did a big study. Over 100 depressed Danes got either cognitive therapy or metacognitive therapy. And here it got apparent that it was more effective to think less instead of thinking differently. So that made me change my approach. For the last 10 years, about halfway through my career, I've been learning people to think less instead of thinking right. So basically, metacognitive therapy is about identifying how much time you spend on your thinking processes and reducing that time, because we know that the time we spend on our ruminations, our worry, thought suppression and so on is completely linked to how depressed we are, how anxious we are, and how well we we cope with life and how present we are in life. So basically, we teach people to spend less time. So let's say the people I meet in my clinic, they spend about, well, minimum 5 hours to the whole day. Even in the evening, they just ruminate. What should I do? What about Corona? How do I find a boyfriend? You know, how do I get a job? What if I get? They spend 10 hours at least thinking about their problems in life, and that overthinking makes them, depressed. They can't sleep at night, insomnia. That takes away their self-esteem and so on. So the overthinking is what we try to reduce in metacognitive therapy.
Oh, it's really, really interesting. And so so just so I understand this differs from cognitive therapy in the way that...
Very much different, yeah.
Very much different. And I think over the last few years, I think a lot of us, in a kind of like general kind of understanding of different therapies have come to understand cognitive therapy. But the metacognitive therapy is to really look at the way that we think, and to really begin to see how we can change that to help us not becoming, not ruminating ourselves into sadness and depression.
Yeah, it's actually opposite cognitive therapy, because in cognitive therapy, in the therapy session, you spend time on your thoughts. When I did cognitive therapy, I would teach my patients to spend time on their thoughts, even more time than they did even. So they would make these thought restructuring papers, writing down their negative thoughts, looking at the evidence for the thought, against the thought. So I would actually ask people to spend more time on their thoughts when I did the CBT, when I did cognitive therapy. And as I said, Professor Adrian Wells realized that it was the time spent on thoughts that was the main problem, not the thoughts themselves, but the time spent. So you can't really overcome thinking too much with more thinking, with more restructuring of your thoughts and working on your thoughts. So we don't do that in metacognitive therapy. We don't use these thought challenging forms. We help people to identify how much time they spend thinking, and teach them the opposite of rumination and worry, which is called detached mindfulness, which is actually not having an empty head. We still have thoughts in our head, but we don't work on the thoughts. So we leave them alone. So we can call it's kind of like lazy therapy, really, because we don't do anything with the thoughts in metacognitive therapy. It's lazy therapy, really. And I like that idea a lot. So it's less work than normal therapy, actually.
I really love that too. It was kind of you're kind of like one of the central ideas you talk about in your book. When I was reading it, was like, the best way we can allow our metacognition to work is to do as little as possible. I feel that's something I can really get behind as an idea. But it sort of runs counter to, perhaps the way we live, that, when we want something, we have to work really hard for it. Or, when we're trying to sort something out, we, feel that we've got to give it our best attention, that we need to, save time to really think about, well, how do I solve this problem? Why am I overwhelmed? Why am I so worried about not working or my business next year? Why am I so consumed by these thoughts? I must give it my best thinking to try and, sort out the problem. This works in other areas, but it doesn't seem to work in our mind. Is that right?
That's exactly the problem. So people who try to work out their depression. Why am I depressed? How can I get out of my depression? Should I take some pills? So they're really working hard to solve their problems, to solve their anxiety. How do I get this heartbeat down? How do I become better at sleeping? So I see that a lot in the clinic, people are trying to solve their insomnia, and by trying to working out their insomnia, they're actually making an insomnia problem. So you can actually problem solve yourself to more problems than you had. So this kind of rumination is the purpose is to work out your depression and try to find out how to become happier and get a better self-esteem and so on. But it has the opposite effect. You maintain yourself in this hole. It's like digging yourself out of a hole. You can't really ruminate yourself out of a depression. You just stay there, really. Yeah, so you have to work less to get out of your depression, work less on your problem to sleep better and so on.
Yeah, I really like.
It's normal to have bad nights. I even have I don't have a depression or anything, or I don't have insomnia, but I still have bad nights where I don't sleep very well. That's normal. But if you start, problem solving those nights where you don't sleep very well, then you actually get completely absorbed with the problem, and it takes off all your space, and in the end you will you'll have an insomnia problem. You actually get the problem more than what you're trying to solve. I just had a man who tried to get his self-esteem up, and he was working on his self-esteem, trying to think positive on his self-esteem and so on. He's been doing that for 20 years. It hasn't helped on the long term. He still had a low self-esteem. So when we start working on ruminating less, leaving the thoughts alone on a bad day when you don't feel like you're good enough, then he actually had a more more dynamic self-esteem, which is a normal self-esteem. So some days you feel good enough and some days you don't feel good enough. And that's the normal dynamic self-esteem. But he didn't allow this self-esteem to be dynamic because he was working so hard to increase his self-esteem all the time.
Yeah, I found that really, really illuminating. And I want to go into that in a little bit more detail, but just to clarify, because I found your book just so incredibly big. It's such a big idea, and I was kind of expecting it to be, kind of like, I knew it had done phenomenally well in Denmark. Congratulations. And, I was thinking, okay, this is another technique that, this is really interesting, but this was kind of quite mind-blowing in its difference of approach. And I want to go into it a bit deeper, particularly some of the things you just said with your client there. But just to clarify, this is very different to repressing your thoughts. This is this is making a distinction between, self-analysis and self-care, and spending all your waking hours ruminating on your issues and problems. I don't want anyone to feel resistant that we're kind of saying, oh, you shouldn't be thinking about yourself, you shouldn't be looking after yourself. It's the rumination that's the key, isn't it?
Exactly. So you'll still have the thoughts in your head. I have a bit of a metaphor for this. I can show you this. So trigger thoughts, we call them trigger thoughts, and that could be anything in your life that would trigger you. So it could be, what about my job situation? What about my mood? Why am I depressed? What can I do? And we call them trigger thoughts, and they're kind of like a mosquito bite. So you can feel them emotionally and physically. They trigger you. They're in your head. So leaving them alone is not an absence of them. They're still there. You can still feel the mosquito bite. But we know what happens when you scratch the mosquito bite too much. Then it becomes worse and it itches even more. So we really need to do the same. As the best solution for a mosquito bite is to leave it alone a bit. We have the first part of the therapy. We teach people to postpone the rumination, wait until 5 o'clock, and then they can, if it's still there, use half an hour on the problem and then leave it alone after that again. So it's kind of reducing the rumination time from, let's say, 10 hours a day to half an hour, and realizing that it's actually possible. Because Professor Adrian Wells, when he got aware that it was the time spent ruminating that was the cause of depression, and the next question was, why do people ruminate? And he realized there were two answers to this question. They don't think they can control it. It's uncontrollable. So they don't think they have a choice. If the mosquito bite is itchy, my thoughts are there. I had to itch it. I can't choose not to do it. I can't wait until 5 o'clock. It's impossible for me. That was one reason. And the other one was usefulness. So people think the more time I spend on my problem, the closer I get to a solution. So there are two reasons why people ruminate too much. I can't control it, and it's useful. It gets me closer to a solution. So we really do work on these two beliefs in metacognitive therapy. And to change this belief, we show people it's actually possible to postpone your rumination until 5 o'clock. And you would realize, if you decide on this, some days you will actually do it. You can wait until 5 o'clock if you instruct yourself, okay, this problem, I will wait to itch on this thought until 5 o'clock. It's still there. It's still ringing me, but I'm not going to answer it until 5 o'clock. And you can actually do that. It's possible. So we work on this uncontrollability belief.
I mean, it's just a hugely interesting idea. So, just to make sure that I've really understood it, the advice of metacognitive therapy is, do not give this trigger thought, as you say, it too much attention, because the more time you give it, the bigger it gets, the more your brain seems to think it needs more attention. It just sucks up all of you. And the second thing is to just say, if you are really worried about something, how is my work going to be next year? Is my business going to survive? Am I going to get COVID? Am I going to get through long COVID? If you feel these trigger thoughts coming, you can literally, you are in control. You can say, I will worry about that, but I'm going to worry about it from 5 o'clock till 6 o'clock, and any other time I'm not. Yeah, and that gives your brain the space to really dig deep, to pull in perhaps solutions that you can't consciously think of.
Exactly. I don't know if you ever tried it. Have you tried to leave a problem alone? You get unique, brilliant ideas sometimes. If you leave your subconsciousness alone and not work on the problem all the time, somebody will hit you. Oh, that's what I'm going to do. Or I had a client the other day. She said, when I'm not using my head so much, it's like my body is telling me what I should know. The body is giving me the answers, because when I spent my 10 hours a day trying to figure out my problems, I didn't have access to my intuition, my gut feeling, all of that just disappeared. But now I have this access because I'm not using my head so much, and my body, my gut feeling is giving me the answers now. So she's explaining it very well, my client.
No, I really love it, and for me, I'm sure a lot of people who come to salon and also will have experienced that you can't solve a problem at the end of the day, but when you wake up the next morning, you will often wake up with a creative solution sometimes, because you've reached your usual brain mechanisms of just not working, and you need to draw on a memory or something. Certainly creatively, I understand how that works. A couple of things that seemed really counterintuitive, and I wanted to ask you about them, was you really advise not over monitoring your mood, and I wondered if you could explain why.
Well, self-monitoring, it's actually also part of CBT, I'm sad to say, but when I did CBT, I was actually asking people when they were depressed to do this weekly form, Monday, Tuesday, Friday, and they should monitor how much they could, how much they enjoyed different activities. So from 0 to 10, they had to monitor how much do I enjoy this, how much do I enjoy that, in order to increase their mood and to have more enjoyable activities. But what really happened when you ask people to monitor themselves so much is that they become aware that they don't really feel like, I don't feel like vacuum cleaning or emptying the dishwasher, or, they score really low on these different everyday activities. And that's not because they're depressed, that's just normal, because we're not supposed to monitor our mood in that much, because they were actually doing it every hour in this form, in this weekly monitoring form. So self-monitoring can actually give you answers you don't really, what can you use them for? Because, if I ask you, how much do you feel like emptying the dishwasher right now from 0 to 10, you would score really low, because not because you're depressed, but because it's a normal thing to not feel like these everyday boring activities. So what we really need to do is to monitor less and realize that it's actually possible to kind of stay on the route, stay on your activities without this monitoring and without this assessing the whole time what you feel like and how you're doing. Because if you leave it alone, it will self-regulate, and you will have good days and bad days. But if you continuously monitor, you would actually keep yourself in this low mood. We see that a lot with people who've been gone down with stress or have been depressed. They start monitoring every morning. How do I feel today? Am I happy? Am I low? Is this a new depression, or is it just a bad day? And this self-monitoring can actually lead to rumination and really start what they wanted to avoid, the low side, the low mood again. So self-monitoring is part of the cognitive attentional syndrome, which is part of the problem, the overthinking problem in the metacognitive therapy.
Yeah.
And we don't do that much.
Your book provides lots of strategies to help with rumination, and also uses case studies. And I want to talk about one of the case studies in a moment. But I wanted to ask. I meant to ask this at the beginning, Pia. It was like, were you surprised that your book did so well? I was just wondering, well, how did it do? Did you know that your book was going to hit? Yeah.
Well, not really. I was just very, very fascinated myself about the method, and I had really good results with the method. But it's very important also to say that to get this method to work and to have these approximately 80% recovery rate, you really need to have a specialist therapist who have been trained, preferably with an MCT Eye Institute, because the quality of metacognitive therapy is important. But I was surprised that my book it's actually translated into 12 languages now, which is a surprise to me too, because but I think it hits a dry spot, because people are really overthinking out there. It's a big problem, and you can't really overcome this overthinking with all this thinking and any other therapy that I know of, CBT, psychodynamic therapy, narrative therapy. In all other therapies, you spend more time on your thinking processes. So we don't really have these very effective method that is teaching people to think less. So this is the first time we have this unique method that can do that. So it really hits, there's only as to my knowledge, there's not many books about the area. Professor Adrian Wells' book, his own book, Metacognitive Therapy for Anxiety and Depression, is for therapists, but there are not many books about this issue, unfortunately, yet.
And you said
it hit a dry spot.
It really, really did. Like I said, it was such a new idea. It was really, really interesting to read about your approach. I think you said earlier on that you, in your original study, with depressed Danes, I think you said, it had a phenomenal success rate. I wondered if you could tell us a bit about that.
Well, we did a big study with over 170 patients who we randomized to either CBT, where you had to think more positive, or MCT, where you had to reduce the time spent ruminating. And we realized that in the CBT, about 55% was recovered afterwards. And that lasted half year follow-up. They were still 55% recovery rate, which is actually a good recovery rate for CBT, because we normally see them from 40 to 60, maximum 60. So 50% is quite a good recovery rate for CBT with regards to depression. But in MCT, we actually had 74% recovery rate. And when I did my literature review as part of my PhD, I did not come across any approaches with that recovery rate. So 74% is it's a unique recovery rate, especially for depression. So for the first time in mankind, we actually have a method here who can reduce with a 74% recovery rate depression. So you can get out of your depression. And it's very short term, because normally people will go from 5 to 12 sessions. So it's a short-term therapy as well, because we only do the focus on the rumination time and the internal focus to the external focus, because the more internally focused you are, the more you keep you keep the depression alive. So if you have your external focus, you can, your inner, your body, your thoughts, your emotion will have the space and peace to self-regulate. So there's a lot of attention training, getting your attention outwards instead of inwards, and a lot of focus on leaving your trigger thoughts alone and reduce the time ruminating. And you can actually recover 74%, which is a huge advance in the psychotherapy.
Yeah, thanks for that, Pia. And I know, thank you for giving a bit more detail, because we did it so quickly at the beginning. It's really important to understand, because I want to go into a little bit more detail on one of your case studies, because it was really interesting in one of your case studies in which the person who comes to try metacognitive therapy is quite resistant, and then when she's told you don't have to believe in it, you just have to try it, which I thought was really, really interesting in terms of her therapy. And I just wanted to also say that the participants in the metacognitive therapy were told to drop everything else that they were doing, like thinking positively or meditating or even practicing mindfulness. And these were all things that she really, really liked. And I wondered if you could explain, it feels counterintuitive. I know it isn't, because I've read the book, but I wondered if you could explain, is this a standard way to begin the therapy, and why is that?
Yeah, so we usually start the therapy by identifying, how much time do you spend working on your problem. And a lot of these strategies, like writing a diary, trying to think positive, talking to people about your problem, we call them co-rumination. Co-rumination is talking a lot about your problems with families and friends. And it can be mindfulness even. It's the time you spend trying to work out your problems. So trying to get yourself in a calm, balanced state. And that's all problem solving. So it's all part of problem solving. So it's not just rumination and worry. It can be thought suppression, writing your thoughts down, co-rumination, and so on. So we actually identify how much time do you spend in total on all these different strategies. And some people spend a lot of time Googling for answers, and a lot of time. So we put that all in the same, cognitive attentional syndrome box, where we focus on our problems. And that's a bit, of course, a drastic solution to completely, stop all that and do nothing for a period of time. But we sometimes do it as a behavioral experiment. So we say, okay, would you be willing to just for a week to, as an experiment, to kind of do nothing about your problems? Just leave your thoughts alone, leave your emotional problems alone, just for a week, and see what happens. And if you don't like it, you go back to your strategies. So it's like a win-win experiment. You can't really lose here, because if it turns out that it was a bad idea, you go back to your mindfulness, thought suppression, positive thinking. You just go back to it. So we do it a bit like a behavioral experiment sometimes to to drop all these strategies just for a shorter period of time. And most people actually like it afterwards. They say, well, I had so much energy, because I spent so much time trying to calm my body all the time, do all this body scanning and so on. But now I have, much more, I'm present, I can play with my kids more, I have much more time available because I'm not spending so much time working on my thoughts and my emotional problems. Yeah.
I absolutely, Pia. I found it really incredible, and I think I so see it in friends and people work with myself as well. That force to hold a thought in a place it doesn't want to do or doesn't want to be, and I think we tend to focus on that. No, this is helpful for my self-esteem. This is helpful for how I feel. But actually, the sheer energy to hold yourself in a state rather than giving into the dynamic feeling of self-esteem, I thought was really interesting. We have got lots of questions coming through, so I'm going to try and weave them in if that's okay. So question from Justin. Hello, Justin. He says, okay, I'm not quite sure which the approach is. Justin, can you let me know? I'll have to. Justin, can you let me know which approach is it the metacognitive approach you're talking about there? A question from Liz Pia. She says, is the work learning to accept the good and bad days?
Well, we don't work on acceptance because that would be doing a lot of thinking again if we have to work on acceptance. So we teach that it's possible to leave negative thoughts and feelings alone so they can have the space to self-regulate. So it's really doing nothing with the bad days so that you have good days naturally coming, and with the bad nights so you have a good night afterwards. So if we leave those, it's like a weather system really. Our emotions are like a weather system. Sometimes it's rainy, sometimes it's sunshine. So if you leave those differences alone and you don't work on your low downs or your problems, then you will self-regulate better. So we don't work on acceptance in the sense that we have to accept. If we don't accept, then it's okay. We can still leave things alone without acceptance. So because there could be some, I don't know, acceptance is a big word, and I don't know if if it's doing something with the thoughts and trying to accept them, that could be working on them too. So we just leave them alone without the acceptance. If we don't accept them, we still leave them alone.
Yeah, no, such a good point. I totally, yes. It's a big, your book is a big concept to us to get our head around. It is amazing. This question from Jim, and I was going to ask that as well. I think it's a really interesting idea. Does the shorter time that you mentioned that generally has effectiveness mean the therapy would cost less to implement for the health service? Our NHS is really looking.
Probably.
We know we've got all kinds of kind of like mental health issues coming. I read in the paper last night that COVID could be as damaging to the nation's national health in the Second World War. Is metacognitive therapy something the NHS could adapt because it's cheaper and more effective than other approaches?
Well, it's definitely cheaper and more effective, but as I mentioned earlier, it's important that we have quality in mind, because if we have it implemented with the bad quality, then you won't have the 80% recovery rate. And people will get disappointed with metacognitive therapy, and we will lose this precious method. So we have to be patient, because it takes at least 2 years to produce a metacognitive therapist. Professor Adrian Wells has got programs in Manchester where you can but it takes some time to really understand this method, because it seems simple in theory, but in practice, it's a very difficult concept to get around doing nothing. How do you do nothing? So it takes about 2 years to produce a quality therapist. And so we need to be patient, because if we're not patient, we just implement it in the NHS without quality, then you will have bad metacognitive therapy, and then you'll get disappointed in the method. And so you won't get the results you see in the literature, unfortunately. So you need to be a bit patient, like with the vaccine in COVID-19. But of course, it can save a lot of money if we get this implemented in the NHS or in Denmark. The problem is, of course, that in Denmark, we just spent millions of Danish kroners to do the whole thing CBT-wise. So all the nurses or the doctors had to go on a 1-year training program in CBT. They spent millions on that from the government. So I'm not sure they're actually willing now to spend millions metifying the whole NHS system in Denmark, and I don't know about that in Britain too, because it's very expensive to do this in a good quality-wise way, of course.
Okay, yeah, and it can be so often for the individual about getting the right therapy for you as well.
Yeah. I mean, at the moment, it's mostly a private offer. So you can, of course, get this a private way, but it's not a publicly metacognitive therapy is not something you can get because it's so expensive to implement, of course.
But you do, which is why your book is great, because it does set it out, and thank you for publishing it. I've got a question from Anna. You might have just answered a question from Anna. Hello Anna. You might have just answered that with your longer question about the application in the NHS. But she says, is there research which checks if the 74% recovery rate is still true in the longer term, and how effective is it in the longer term compared to other forms of therapy?
We don't really know yet, but at the moment we're doing a 4 or 5 year follow-up study, which is very unique because I don't know if many studies would can do this. It's very difficult to get people because they change the phone number, and we're trying to track them down and get about 70% in a 4-5 year study, but it's difficult. So I really hope we get the 70%, and then we can do another article. So I don't know yet about the results on the long run. We only know about half-year follow-up. And at half-year follow-up, after the treatment is finished, we still have this 74% recovery rate. We know it from other studies. There was a big study on generalized anxiety, and they did a 2-year follow-up. And about, I think it was 66% was still generalized anxiety-free with metacognitive therapy 2 years after the treatment has terminated, where it was only about 30% who were still generalized anxiety-free with CBT 2 years follow-up. So we do have these 2-year follow-ups with generalized anxiety. There was a huge study there in Norway, but we don't know yet about depression, unfortunately.
Okay, thanks, Anna. Great question. Yeah, this is a question from Justin. Hello, Justin. And he said yes, and he said to clarify, accepting Pia's approach has value. Are there clients for whom she thinks other approaches are more appropriate, and why?
Well, of course, it's not a 100% recovery rate, so it's only 80%, 70 to 90, depending on the disorder. But of course, some people will not recover. It's a very gentle method, so you won't get worse. Like with my big study with CBT versus MCT, some people actually got worse in CBT. You don't have that kind of risk in metacognitive therapy because it's so gentle and it's very, so like with post-traumatic stress, for example, we don't dig in and do exposure therapy. So it's very gentle treatment. You don't get worse. But of course, not everyone recovers. So we still have 20% who need something else. Or maybe more metacognitive therapy. So we don't have a 100% recovery rate, and some people, of course, would need something else. So metacognitive therapy is not for everyone.
Thank you, Pia, and thanks, Justin. It's brilliant. And a question from Jill. Hello, Jill. I haven't said hello to you. How are you doing? Merry Twixmas. Jill, Pia, what do you think? I don't know what this is, so sorry. What do you think of AEDP and its focus on the body rather than thought? Well,
I'm not a specialist in the. It's mindfulness-based CBT, as I understand, right? So it's a program where you do some body scanning, some breathing exercises, and there's a bit of leaving thoughts alone too. But it's a program where you incorporate all these different strategies, and some of them would go in line with metacognitive therapy, leaving your thoughts alone. But a lot of them will go contrary metacognitive therapy because focusing on your body scanning, breathing exercise and so on, that would be too much internally focused, and that's not leaving your system alone to self-regulate. That would be too much focused on your breathing and so on.
Okay, thank you, Jill. So, and a comment from Julie who says, Pia, it's wonderful to hear the invitation to be. I am an integrative body psychotherapist. There is a long tradition here of the mind-body-spirit approach which works with all level of human experience. We all need help sometimes to feel safe and enjoy being embodied and present, including when we need compassion for when we are not feeling this. Thanks for the interesting talk. Absolutely, Junie. Thank you indeed. Pia, I've got a question from Matthew. Is there any evidence on the impact of MCT on people diagnosed with autism spectrum conditions?
No, not at the moment. There's no studies that I know of with autism, unfortunately. So it's a new approach, and we only have big studies on depression, PTSD, and generalized anxiety, and so on. But we still need eating disorders, autism, and so on. So there's a lot of it's an unstudied field still. But like with CBT, it takes a lot of time to do all these studies. So we don't know about autism yet. We have good experience in the clinic because we have many thousands of clients through the clinic, and we do have good results. But it's more like anecdotes. We don't have any studies with hardcore data. But it seems to work on autism. Yeah.
Thank you, Matthew. There's a couple of questions I want to get in before we finish here, and one of the questions was that it really came out of reading was this idea that people who have had depression or tend to think that it's their lot in life to be depressed or to be at risk for it, and it really resonated, this idea that people who are prone to depression, that we tend to feel that we have more of an unstable psyche than other people. And there is a danger that you can hold yourself back and try and live life in the slow lane. I wondered if you had any advice on how to, if there was any truth in that, or if you had any advice for people who feel like that.
Well, unfortunately, I meet a lot of people who think they have a brain damage because I'm depressed, so there's something wrong with me. I have to hold back on life because I'm disordered. There's something wrong with me. There's something wrong with my brain. So they've been told that by a psychiatrist and so on. So they have a hard time, realizing because that is only a rumination problem. I had one person who's been in treatment for 20 years with chronic depression on and off, and he was cured in those 6 sessions, just reducing his rumination. And he was just, oh my God, why had no one told me this? Why had no one taught me this? For 20 years, I've been in and out of psychiatric wards, and people have told me I had brain damage and so on, and it was just a rumination problem. But the thing is, he couldn't have this treatment before. But now that he has realized he can control his rumination, he can actually live his life independent of those negative thoughts and feelings that he sometimes have. Then he doesn't have to hold back, and he can actually live life. But it's hard to believe before you had metacognitive therapy that it's actually a rumination problem, and that you don't have to keep yourself back, because mostly in society you're told that depression is a brain damage problem. You can't do anything. You have to. So it's a really new concept to get to realize, oh my God, it's a rumination problem. No one had told me that before. It's a new way of seeing depression and understanding depression. But once you realize it and you realize you can control your rumination, there's no limits. You can actually live life as you want, because now, like with my other client who was low self-esteem and so on, he had avoided dates because he was afraid of the trigger thoughts he would have when women would reject him. He didn't dare to have those trigger thoughts of rejection because he would ruminate himself to depression. So he wouldn't go on dates. He wouldn't go on job interviews, because he was afraid to get rejected there and ruminate himself to depression. But now when he realized he can control the rumination, the world was open. He now goes on dates and he goes on job interviews because he's not afraid of the negative trigger thoughts, because now he can choose if he wants to spend half an hour at 5 o'clock, or if he wants to ruminate the whole night when he gets rejected from a woman or from a job interview. So the world is open to him now. He doesn't have to hold back, which is good.
Yeah, no, that's really, really lovely. I enjoyed reading about that. I think it can really resonate with not needing to feel so fated, if that's how you experience that tendency towards depression. I wanted to ask about grief, because it's been a huge subject for this year, and in some ways I think we've really got to grips with this idea of rumination and how we can be in control, how we can limit it, the dangers of overthinking. But what about something you can't help ruminating on? Say the loss of a loved one.
Well, you can still have emotions without rumination, so you still feel grief. So metacognitive therapy will not make you numb. It won't reduce your emotions. So even if you had metacognitive therapy, you still have grieving. You still you still get happy. You still get sad and happy, and you still have all those emotions. You still grieve when someone dies. When someone in your family dies, you still have strong emotional feelings like you get. So that won't change. So you can still have strong emotions without rumination. So when someone you love dies, you would feel grieving and you will have a strong emotional reaction, but it will self-regulate if you don't ruminate so much. So you can still have strong emotions without rumination. And then you won't get this. I think in Denmark, there's a new diagnosis called prolonged grief. I don't know if you have that in Britain too, but prolonged grief, you can actually now know what you need to do in order to get this diagnosis. So everyone grieves, but not everyone gets prolonged grief diagnosis, and you need to add a lot of thought suppression, emotional suppression, rumination, and so on, a long time. It takes, in order to fulfill this diagnosis, it has to be at least half a year of prolonged thinking to get this. So again, everyone will. I mean, metacognitive therapy won't take away emotional suffering, and life is a tough one. You both get what do you call it, when you are very, very happy, you still get very happy days, but you still get grieving too. So you still have the ups and downs, even with metacognitive therapy. So it can't take away the grieving, but you can choose how much time you still ruminate there.
Okay.
Does it make sense?
Yes, it does make sense. Of course, you're going to feel grief, but it's almost like grief is an important part of being human, and it happens to all of us.
Of course.
But there
Natural.
is something that you will regulate with in time as you grow to incorporate that feeling into your life.
Exactly.
But it is perhaps an area where you could be at danger of going down the rumination route if you're prone to it. Yeah.
Exactly.
And that is perhaps something to really look out for.
Yeah. So metacognitive therapy is really working on the diagnosis. It's not working on normal emotional reactions like grieving, being in love. We're not really changing those emotional reactions that are natural. We're just making sure people are not getting a diagnosis. So if you get fired, you still get sad. You still get very, oh, what am I going to say? You really ruminate. But in time, you will stop your rumination. Whereas if you continue ruminating, then you will go from sad to depressed. So we don't really change the emotional suffering and ups and downs. We just change the diagnosis. We can get people out of diagnosis. So you don't get the prolonged grief diagnosis. You don't get depression. You still have nervous time when you go on exam, but you don't get anxiety disorder. So you still worry, but you don't get generalized anxiety disorder. So you would just change the diagnosis. We don't take away these natural emotions from people.
Oh, okay, it's absolutely brilliant. I've got it completely. Thank you so much, Pia. It has been an extraordinary look at your work. I'm not surprised that your book has done so phenomenally well. I'm so glad it's been published in many languages, and it's been a brilliant introduction to metacognitive therapy. I wondered if you have any advice for us on our mental health for the coming year.
Well, there's a lot to worry about. There's climate change, and there's corona, and I mean, we all have trigger thoughts. That's inevitable. I still have them too. So the best advice would probably be to wait until 5 o'clock to work on those problems, because then you can problem solve without getting stressed, depressed, and so on. So my best advice would probably be to kind of agree with yourself that you will wait until a specific time, and then try to problem solve half an hour maximum. So you can be present with your kids, with your jobs and so on, and try to engage in hobbies and other things than this thinking process. So postponing until 5 o'clock is probably my best advice.
I really
for
love
people
that.
in these corona time.
and that's why we began our morning with making cinnamon buns.
That's actually a craving trigger thought. So you can also leave, if you're on a diet, you have craving trigger thoughts, eat the sugar. You can leave those alone too, and wait until 5 o'clock to engage. But they're called craving trigger thoughts.
Okay, well, that's good advice. We wanted to create some sort of Scandi beginning to our morning, and it's been so superb to talk to you in Denmark. Congratulations on your work and your book, and I very much hope we get to see you again soon. Thank you, Pia.
Me too. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for thank you. Oh yes, lovely comments, brilliant from some lovely comments, Pia. Brilliant from Matthew, Fiona, thank you, very interesting. Jill, Helen, thank you so much for this, fascinating. Liz, thank you for a super session. Pia's book is available in the foyer, and we will send it to you with some love hearts. We're lovely. In the meantime, thank you so much for joining. Thank you so much for joining us, Pia.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being part of our first of 3 sessions that we're looking at the stress and anxiety of this year and how we can kind of begin to process this year and step forward positively into next year. We will be hearing from Kathleen Smith later on with who'll be in conversation with Nikki Hodgson. We'll see you at 11 o'clock for Natalie Haynes' news review.